think this is the last slide in terms of overlays. So within the flight paths to the airports, appropriate zones would be heavy industry, or a zone that reflects the current operative district plan, or a less intensive zone. So essentially no residential intensification within the aircraft noise overlays. In terms of the electricity transmission corridor, the key principle there is really that the terrace and apartment zone, the 5 to 7 story zone, should not be located within that corridor directly under the transmission lines. Interestingly on that one, the Transpower who managed the high voltage lines were quite happy for any zoning under the overlay. They felt the overlay would be sufficient to manage development under the overlay. They can also rely on a national environmental standard to protect those transmission corridors. The panel issued some best practice approaches for rezoning. They didn't get right down into the principles around individual zones in the way that the council did in this guidance. They were really just, some of them are more technical nature, some are more strategic. So the first one, that any zoning on the map should be consistent with the objectives and policies of the zone. The overall impact of any rezoning through the submissions and hearings process should ensure that the maps are consistent with the regional policy statement. Economic costs and benefits should be considered. Any changes to the maps that went out for submissions should take into account issues debated in recent plan changes. Changes to the zone boundaries should be consistent with the Auckland-wide rules and overlays. We weren't probably entirely clear what the panel's best practice approach was there. Changes should take into account the specific features of the site and the land that it's on. Zone boundary changes should recognise the availability or lack of major infrastructure. There should be adequate separation between incompatible land uses, i.e. houses should not be next to heavy industry. So there's some consistency with the council's principles. Any zone boundaries need to be clearly defensible. They should follow property boundaries and not slice through the middle of a property. Spot zoning, i.e. a single site or a couple of sites just on their own within a wider zone, should be avoided. Zoning shouldn't be determined by an existing resource consent or an existing use right, but these can be taken into account, and roads should not be zoned. They should simply be shown as roads. And yeah, that's really a summary of the principles endorsed by the committee that influenced a lot of the mapping work that took place and the guidance from the panel.
Again, well done, John. Queries on this particular section, members? Simon. Come on up, Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Noting that topics 80 and 81 are the most controversial, I'll try not to be, but I'll ask and we'll see how that goes.
Who said that, Simon? No one here today has said that. Easy.
Maybe I'm casting aspersions on the process. Anyway,
talking about the zoning principles.
Yeah, so I mean the principles and our board were largely supportive of them. They effectively gave effect to the RPS and also were reflected in the zone objectives and policies. And so it sort of it showed a sensible approach to how you'd look at kind of zoning and that sort of thing, and that was applied. That came up with a series of maps after the PORP was notified, and about how they might be applied, and took into account kind of constraints being removed in terms of the 1944 controls and those sorts of things. I'm just interested in, obviously there's two ways to go for the panel. There is looking back at the RPS and the zone objectives and policies, if there's a conflict between those and the zoning maps, or to look at the zoning and create the alignment there. Do we have any indication sort of which way we're leaning? Because obviously with these principles there's potentially a gap there. And I guess the second thing is given that most of the submissions were sitting sort of on the latter approach, do we have any indication whether the panel was sort of there, noting that we didn't have experts to provide a counter view, more in a moderate camp on that one?
It's a bit difficult. I mean, you're almost asking for a telegraphing of the report or the recommendations that are yet to be tabled. So I think we need to be careful about even asking our staff, you know, which way the IHP is leaning.
I understand that, Chris, but in terms of all of the other topics that have been presented, at least there was a view of where submitters were pushing and discussion so far. So I guess I'm asking along those lines rather than to make windows into the minds of the interviewer.
So do we have any interim guidance?
Well, no, they called this one best practice approaches, not interim guidance. And as I say, it was sort of strategic stuff about linking into the RPS and objectives and policies in the plan, and in more technical mapping stuff. They didn't really talk about individual zones. In terms of submitters, I mean, I can make the comment, I think as you've heard before, Housing New Zealand were probably one of the most vocal submitters.
Sorry, guys.
Goodness sake. Get a hold of yourself, girl.
We're not listening.
The ambassador for the SPCA was just checking.
Take it outside.
Can someone take that man on a tech course? Okay, we'll carry on.
So, yes, we know Housing New Zealand developed their own principles and presented evidence at the panel, and their principles were different to the principles that we ran through here. They were broadly seeking a more expansive terrace and apartment zoning and a more expansive mixed housing urban zoning in most places. Other submitters, I don't know if anyone came in fully behind the council and said we support the council's principles. Can you recall, Celia, Rebecca?
I think mostly it was the people who were most interested in their own particular sites.
Yeah.
So Housing New Zealand was probably, and the Architects Association, they were more interested in the strategic influence and how that influenced the zoning at ground level. So there was, most of the other submitters though was about their own particular properties.
I guess, I mean, in terms of the panel's best practice approaches, I mean, the second bullet point is obviously the keenest one, and Housing New Zealand seemed to focus on this one as well as the Minister in their submission, which is the overall impact of rezoning is consistent with the RPS. And I guess that's going to be the crunchy thing that will definitely come up, and there was a lot of debate there. I guess it's just trying to understand, was that just a stark statement without any further explanation in terms of whether or not the council's approach in the notified plan met this or didn't? Or
Well, as I think we've mentioned, there has been no guidance as to whether the panel felt the council's maps were heading in the right direction or not, but what we do know is that they were very interested in the capacity for growth modelling work, both the feasible and the enabled capacity work that's been presented to the committee before. I'm not sure if you've heard any of those presentations, but our experts and the experts from other submitters, Housing New Zealand, property developers, Auckland 2040, were all involved in that modelling work, and we certainly got a sense that the panel thought that modelling work was absolutely critical in terms of looking at how the zoning maps and the zone rules, particularly for residential, relate back to the RPS. So you get a strong sense that the panel was looking at the whole capacity issue from a rules perspective, from a maps perspective, linking it all back to the RPS and their thoughts around the RPS. So, yeah, I'd certainly make that as a comment. And in terms of who was aligned with our principles, we did have Institute of Architects, Urban Auckland, Gen Zero, basically say they thought that these principles were pretty robust and pretty sound.
And I guess, and take your guidance, Mr. Chair, that we'll have to wait and see. But I guess the crunchy bit will be, we've got principles, and whether or not the zones actually map onto those will be the key thing. And then if the panel feels that they don't, then it's going to be interesting, the recommendation of either changing the principles or changing the zones. But I guess I'll have to wait on that one. Thank you.
We will all have to wait. Councillor Cashmore.
Yes, thanks. Slightly different note. Within the rural zone, you've got the countryside living zone, and then we talk about quarries and not to compromise their activity. In fact, those three big quarries that are in the south that provide 80%, 3 million tonnes of aggregate for Auckland a year, either are on or close proximity or travel immediately through countryside living zones.
Yep.
And I live with the reverse sensitivity that causes on a virtually day-by-day basis. What work is being done around that work, that route protection? Is that anywhere in the unitary plan as proposed?
Yeah, well, I suppose this principle is signalling that if through the submissions process council was looking to apply new countryside living areas, we shouldn't be applying any more adjacent to those quarries because there are already existing reverse sensitivity issues there. So this principle is quite good in helping us respond to submissions that asked for more countryside living around a quarry. And there weren't a huge number, but there were some. But in addition to the zones, we have a quarry transport route that provides some protection for existing quarries, and also the quarry buffer area that gives some additional protection for the quarries.
Lay it down.
Yeah, so there are two overlays that gives that protection for the quarries. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cashmore. Councillor Walker?
Yeah, just a related issue to quarries, and these are clean fills, which are not quarries, but they amount to holes in the ground. They get filled up in some respects with worse product than you have in quarries, clay and stuff that generates a lot of dust. You've got a significant number of transport movements, significant, and I mean significant reverse sensitivity effects for neighbouring landowners. Are we tightening up around them in any way, shape or form?
I can't recall their exact activity status, but it would either be probably discretionary or non-complying in most of the rural areas. So any future clean fills would go through a resource consent process, and then it really becomes an issue of whether or not those clean fills are consented, and if they are consented, what conditions are placed on the consent to deal with volumes of traffic, upgrading transport networks and so on. So the unitary plan certainly has restrictions in place on any new clean fills in Auckland, and good policies in place to look at the impacts of those.
Okay, well, I guess I just put the principle to you that we've got these things around quarries. Sometimes the impacts from clean fills are even worse, and you know, issues of reverse sensitivity and the like aren't considered to anywhere near the same degree from my experience.
Thank you. Any last questions on this particular section, members? Zoning principles? Then I think we're concluded. John, anything else to add?
Yeah, this was the fifth of our information sessions. We've got one more before the 22nd of July when the panel comes back with its recommendations. So I think in a fortnight, we're doing a bit of a recap on the overall process, some of the legal parameters around decision making that were talked about by Catherine and her team in the first information session. So really the next one is just a bit of a recap on the first session. I don't think we're talking about any unitary plan topics, or we are? We've got.
Yeah,
We've still got.
We're talking about infrastructure, transport, and flooding and hazards.
Oh, just a few minor ones, but.
Thank you,
and in addition to that, we're doing a recap on the process, and then we're into the last week or two before the panel's recs come back.
Okay, and it's probably worth just reminding us again the date of receipt within council management of the recommendations, and then the interim, very short interim period, the date the councillors receive the information.
So it's Friday the 22nd of July. We expect to receive one on a USB stick, the panel's recommendations and revisions to the unitary plan. We're not sure exactly what time on that Friday the 22nd. We'll have a small team of our lead people really analysing those over the weekend, preparing for a briefing for the committee and local board chairs on the following Wednesday morning, which is the 27th of July, and then Wednesday afternoon or evening, all of the recommendations and everything from the panel will be on the council website for the public on that following Wednesday.
So just in terms of the Wednesday, would it be prior to the Wednesday or on the Wednesday that the councillors receive the information?
It will be on the Wednesday.
On the Wednesday. Councillor Fletcher?
Mr. Chairman, I'm just seeking some guidance. I've been very mindful of the request that we don't make public comment, and that isn't easy because, you know, that is sought. But I'd just like clarification in and around this, just so that we all know exactly where we stand on this issue.
Okay, John
It's
and maybe
really-
Catherine? Thanks for that question. So it's an important one to go over again.